Hi, I'm Peter Almond, and today we're originating from the Gloucester Writer Center. And with us is Lise Breen, a longtime Lanesville resident, who is an independent researcher with a long background in cultural inquiry, which she's now brought to bear on this vexing topic. We're talking about local history. In particular, the history of Black people on Cape Ann, as well as abolition efforts on this northern Cape. And before we begin, I just want to say briefly that the issues that come up around slavery and the experience of Black people tend to be kind of seen in a broad brush. The assumption is that areas of the North would be opposed to slavery and open-minded about the participation of Black people in community life, and that the South was the slaveholding society. The story is far more complex than that, and that's why it's very important to hear from researchers and students of the matter like Lise Breen. Tell us a little bit about the method you use to kind of dig up and sort out the history that we are talking about.
A lot of this evidence is right in front of our faces. And that's why I have been fascinated by it. But I think Fredrick Douglass said it best. He came to this port, which was an important port in terms of shipping, and he said, inculcated forgetfulness is seen as a duty. He said this in 1865. I've tried to use his words and to find what I can instead of willfully forgetting parts of our past that we may not want to remember. And as I said, a lot of this is right there in front of us if we only want to look. If we go to, for instance, the original church records, which we are extraordinarily fortunate to have, we find all kinds of people who were never transferred over or transcribed over into published records. Why they never made it over, I'm not exactly sure. Sometimes I can reason that it's because adult baptisms did not count as births, so they weren't considered as important, but there were enslaved people here who were baptized as adults and are noted as such. So if we go to the original records, we can find sometimes mentions of these people. In addition to church records, I use deeds, I use probates, particularly probates, because they often list property of the owner at death. And many times on Cape Ann, I find indications that owners had not 1, 2, 3, 4, and sometimes, contrary to what we think about New England, sometimes more people. In one case, 8, and local history says 15 for another person.
So when you refer to the numbering, you mean people who were enslaved?
Yes. So when a person died, there was generally, particularly if he died without a will, there is an inventory taken of his holdings. And so he can pay taxes, his estate can pay taxes, and so his heirs can divvy up the property fairly. Mm-hmm. And these people are listed on the estate holdings. And oftentimes, sometimes they're named, oftentimes they are not. Oftentimes they're given, something like Negro man, or Negro girl, or Negro child. there are those kinds of accountings. They take me up short. They still shock me because for instance, one woman I saw was listed on the same line as a grinding stone. Often these people are listed between livestock. The pigs are on one line and the horse on another, and there is the person in between. So going with that, then I try and trace from the probate record the heirs and see if I can find more details, and sometimes I can.
You pointed out that poet Charles Olson led you
Yes.
through your sea slave trade history with the line, "The cargoes they bought back were black, and the library possibly so founded." Where's that from, and what does that mean?
In this case, I was working on a city project conducted by some volunteers who wanted to create a walking trail dedicated to Gloucester's history, a short, innocuous walking trail. And I was trying to find something to use to describe our library. Charles Olson, in his Maximus poems, Charles Olson was a well-known poet who died in 1970, who was particularly interested in American history and Gloucester's history. In his second letter, in his famous Maximus poems, he has that line. And I was astounded, and from there wanted to go on and explore. I had no idea that there had been enslaved people here or anyone engaging in the slave trade. In fact, a lot of my work and my most explosive findings are about the illegal, criminal, international slave trade that a few members of Gloucester, a small circle of prominent individuals participated in during the 1840s and the 1850s. And the reason this is so explosive is because it's so close to the Civil War, because these people are recalled as philanthropists and community leaders and patriots still today, because they were all members of one particular church in Gloucester, which was so essential to our city's history. There were two slave ship investors here who were prominent individuals. One was a member of the Gloucester Lyceum, as well as a founding member of the Universalist Church. His father had been. His son ends up as a ship merchant and hires his brother-in-law to captain a slave ship. And what this is a schooner that were mostly used during this period, which is also surprising to us because we love our beautiful schooners here in Gloucester. He took his vessel to Africa, to Luanda. He loaded up his cargo and dropped these people off at a Brazilian port near Bahia, and then abandoned the vessel in the harbor. The British wrote that he made off in a Swedish brig. So this was truly an international undertaking.
So slave trade at that point was outlawed both in England, Britain, and in the United States. So this is a complicated, you're making the point that it was somehow skirting the US and British.
Oh, absolutely. International slave trade had been outlawed in Massachusetts as early as 1788. Participation in any importation of Africans into Massachusetts was clearly outlawed. Federally, it was prohibited January 1st, 1808. Everyone knew this was going to happen for many years and took advantage of the dates to load enslaved people and take them to the South before that date. Afterwards, it is absolutely illegal and the trade dies down for a bit. It starts to pick up again, and alarmed over the years, the penalties increasingly until 1819, 1820, when it was made a capital crime, and one could be executed if they were found participating in the illegal international slave trade. Because slavery is legal in the United States domestically, of course, captains were free to transport enslaved people from southern ports to other southern American ports. They were not free to engage in the importation of Africans to any port whatsoever.
So there was an economy around this activity that was legal, but still clearly was quite involved in the trade or the movement of enslaved people for business purposes, so to speak. You've mentioned that you have found cases where slave people where Black people were kidnapped in the North and possibly in our Cape Ann region for sale, presumably, to the South. What cases have you found of that?
I have found several cases. One as early as 1788 with a captain whose name is very well known on Cape Ann. His name was Solomon Babson, and he is lauded in our history books as a privateer. But he took his schooner called the Ruby into Boston Harbor, and there the descriptions are he inveigled 3 free Black men onto his vessel with saying that he was in distress and he needed it repaired. He got them down into the hold, put them in irons, closed the door on them, and then sailed off to Martinico. There was a famous Black activist abolitionist named Prince Hall who immediately knew something was up because one of these men was a Black Freemason along with him. And he immediately put in an advertisement in the newspapers. That advertisement went as far away as Philadelphia, saying that Solomon Babson with the schooner Ruby has taken our men and sailed off to, we're not sure, but we think Martinico. So there was this explicit link of our Gloucester captain with his vessel, with this kidnapping. One of the men made a sign to a Masonic sign to a purported purchaser who became alarmed. And with the help of John Hancock, the founder of the Massachusetts Historical Society, mostly Jeremy Belknap, the French consul, they were able to locate the men, bring them their proof of freedom, and sail them back to Boston. It was a major event. There were celebrations in on the town center.
Yeah.
Solomon Babson was never prosecuted. Jeremy Belknap said he thought he had heard he was in Baltimore, but he could not be found. But he certainly would punish his conspirators and co-conspirators. And indeed, I did find the court documents where one of them was punished, another was put in jail. They did not find Solomon Babson, and Babson ended up selling everything in Gloucester and moving on to New Gloucester, Maine, and making a fresh start for himself. He died in the West Indies a few years later on another voyage. But this is someone we still recall as a great privateer. I think our best Victorian era history of Cape Ann says he brought home a wonderful load of butter and bacon on his schooner, the Ruby. Well, we know what else he tried to bring home, a load of gold from St. Eustatia and Martinico. So that was an early case. And then I've found other cases, and one in 1841, 1842, which almost caused an international hullabaloo.
It's fascinating that, again, I made the point that we make a kind of broad brush assumption that the North was anti-slavery, and that therefore a movement like abolition of slavery would be welcome and embraced in the North. And apparently up here in Cape Ann, and we share an experience of the deep ambivalence of this northern region, New England, and all the northern states about the issue of slavery. So tell us a little bit about abolition's history here in Cape Ann.
Abolitionists were seen mostly everywhere as they were characterized as cranks and on the outer fringes. People were very much worried about the outcome of immediate abolition. That is what the abolitionists were about. It wasn't as though people objected here in the North to the end of slavery per se. They just wanted it in their own time, on their own terms, like, let me make another buck from it first, please. Because we had so many business interests vested in the continuation of slavery, this was a very hard thing to end. And we profited from slavery in a number of ways. We took our dried ground fish, generally hake or poor quality cod or flounder, to both the southern ports and also to the West Indies. The southern port business relationships were thriving and fresh. We also picked up on our way back from those southern ports cotton that had been produced with slave labor, and that was transported to the North. 50% of the mills, the cotton mills, were based in the North, a lot of them in Massachusetts. We even had a mill in Rockport. Our local museum has a wonderful painting of a lauded artist, Fitzhenry Lane, who his first painting shows a packet ship of cotton on fire in the middle of the ocean, hit by lightning. One wonders what his thoughts were about that, but we really don't know. Yes, so abolition was fraught here. It was deeply divisive, but far and large, the majority of people did not support abolition here. We had two small anti-slavery societies for a brief time, but those who followed William Lloyd Garrison said in time and time again, Gloucester was in the Dark Ages. Gloucester, they had a few friends here, but they were far too fearful to help with the cause. Gloucester, like other places, shut its doors, particularly the churches. The churches shut their doors to any abolitionists who wanted to speak. And I see this again and again throughout Essex County, in Manchester as late as 1845, in Newburyport, in Gloucester, and in Rockport.
I would just add that what we're saying in general, though, is that at the time you are looking at slavery, the national economy was so heavily invested in slave-related activity. And so a region or sub-region like Cape Ann, which has such a heavy involvement with shipping, almost inevitably gets drawn into the economic advantages of being quite involved with not so much slave trade, but the economic movement of goods that are the result of slavery, like cotton obviously comes from the South up here and then gets shipped somewhere, like to England and so forth.
And earlier, before cotton, we had distilleries in Gloucester. We made New England rum, and that was what was ferried also to Africa. I did find an account of a William Lloyd Garrison speaking to a Manchester audience. Manchester is a small town that abuts Cape Ann. It was considered far more progressive than by abolitionists in terms of their attitudes towards ending slavery. But this account, which is Unfortunately, it was not dated as to when Garrison came to visit. When he spoke to this Manchester congregation, he said he held the church members more than any other members of society, that they sinned against the greater light and knowledge. He charged that the complicity of the church in the sin of slavery had robbed it of its rightful spiritual power, that the church members were cowards and incompetents. Garrison looked up from his manuscript and deep into the eyes of everyone in the congregation, saying, "It is in vain that you come into this tastefully decorated place for prayer, and the warmth and light of these comfortable surroundings sing." And he says, when everyone knows that you don't dare to face your next door neighbor, even in progressive Manchester, people were held to task.
The experience with race and true integration or true expression of rights is an ongoing struggle, and the shock of local incidents and local detail that you pull together is bracing and even painful to acknowledge, but it's really our way to construct a real history of the experience of Black people in America. And these cases, I don't want to minimize it by calling it local history, but they're so illuminating of what really happened writ large in the nation, and that unfortunately one has to sort of look at local institutions, local noted cultural and historical figures, and often finds this tainted record of their behavior vis-a-vis slavery itself or Black people as human beings. It's invaluable that you bring these issues to our attention. Where will you go next? Are you writing a book, for example, or are you preparing articles on this subject, and how can our audience follow what you do?
Oh, that's so kind of you to ask. I have a number of essays that I hope to collate into a book. And I'm going to be blogging with two history friends on a website called Atlantic Black Box, which is now beginning as a clearinghouse for information of this sort. The two people that I work with are also very interested in Essex history in terms of Black history. One woman is an expert on freedom suits, which were generated by Black people to challenge their enslavement. We're all interested in tracing the lives and trying to, in whatever way we can, recover some of this evidence and trace people through time and place. And, you know, it is interesting because we can't just rely on our own local archives to do this project. As I mentioned, you know, I used British archives. I find things in other towns because people move.
Oh. So the work you do is painstaking and involves a sort of following the trail, and it gets very obscure and requires a kind of doggedness. I would point out that Lisa's work has reached the attention of Pulitzer Prize winning historians like David Blight and Eric Foner, who are the noted Emancipation Reconstruction historians. And they have found references that Lise has unearthed that they've never been aware of, that and yet are central to their work. And so I would say that you have a good prospect ahead of getting your work published, because it is so remarkably carefully researched and organized and unique, because this local history on this topic of slavery and abolition has not been carefully pursued, and even perhaps at times it's been neglected or avoided just because the topic is so frankly controversial or uncomfortable to acknowledge a difficult past. And we're grateful to you for your work.
There is so much that needs to be reclaimed, reevaluated, rethought. It's been astonishing. It's been an astonishing voyage, and I have learned so much from it. And I still need to learn in order to put things in proper context. It's been fascinating, and I encourage other people to begin to look at their own town archives and their own primary sources and their own secondary sources as well, because how these accounts are broached and couched in the secondary texts are also fascinating.
There's this wonderful line, I've quoted it to you before, from Natasha Trethewey. She's a former poet laureate of the US, and she writes of the experience of Black people, all the dead letters unanswered, untold stories of those that time will render mute. And I think your work attempts to give voice to the untold stories and tell them.
I would like to close with one untold story that has been fascinating for me over the last few months. Because Gloucester is celebrating its 400th anniversary, this man is someone who was missed in the records. His name was Gloucester, and he was enslaved. And he was sent up to New Gloucester, Maine, to help build a kind of a garrison. And he writes his owner, and he says, "Dear master and mistress, I would very much like to stay here and help continue to build our new village here." He asks for supplies that he needs and the few other white men who are with him. And then he says, "If you're willing, sir, I would like to stay and send my love to the little master." Well, he has to return to Gloucester because his owner died. He's in the probate with he's named. He's in the widow's probate, and then he's offered for sale about 20 years later as a good husbandry man, a good seaman, and knows how to run a sawmill. It says everything. It says everything about slavery.
Yeah, that it always had a price.
It always had a price. They were not part of the family. And no matter what he said, no matter how he pled, it didn't count for anything.
Lise, thank you so much for visiting with us today.
Thank you for this conversation, Peter, and many thanks to the Gloucester Writer Center as well.